This video summarises a groundbreaking new report called Intergenerational Theft, the £13 trillion UK government heist that made the baby boomer generation undeservingly rich by stealing from the young and future generations, and why this injustice profoundly matters. Introduction. The recent so-called cost of living crisis that emerged in 2022, post-pandemic and driven by inflation, is actually dwarfed by the real cost of living crisis for younger people, which is caused by intergenerational theft. If you're a young person, you're facing an unprecedented set of life challenges, and you'll probably recognise most of these. Still living with your parents, cannot afford to move out or rent or even dream of buying a home. Crippling rent takes most of your wages, and so saving for a house deposit is a pipe dream. No wage increases means your rent or your mortgage remains a large percentage of income throughout your life. You're forced to live in much smaller accommodation than your parents' generation. If you're single, no choice but to live in shared accommodation. Your wages are low and stagnating, whilst all your bills just seem to go up and up. As non-graduate jobs pay so poorly, you feel forced into a highly demanding graduate job. Even if you do have a graduate job or professional job, you still feel poor. You're experiencing financial and job insecurity. You're experiencing professional and emotional strain, leading to severe stress and mental health issues. You have a long commute that's expensive. You're unable to afford to have children. You're financially infertile, as it's euphemistically put. You're struggling to pay crippling childcare costs and feel you have no time for your children. Your children are growing up in cramped conditions, stunting their intellectual and emotional growth. You're drowning in debt, student loans, overdrafts, credit card debt, mortgage debt. Ultimately, all of your life's milestones are delayed, deferred, and ultimately denied. For example, moving out, moving in with a partner, buying a home, getting married, having children. Do you recognize any of these? If so, you're the victim of intergenerational theft. Now let's put this in some macroeconomic context. The following charts show something very interesting that's happened since the post-war period. After the war, up until around 1980, there was a long period that was called the Great Prosperity or Shared Prosperity, because what happened was that as the economy grew, GDP grew, wages matched that and kept pace with that. So people felt that they had a stake, they had a share in that growing national wealth. Post-1980, we had a series of right-wing governments come into power that had a completely different agenda. And since then, you can see there's been a growing divergence between wages, the blue line, and red line, which is the GDP growth. So yes, the overall GDP has grown, but wages have fallen significantly behind GDP growth, and nearly half of what they would have done if they'd kept pace with GDP growth. Now, the significance of that is that as wages fell, people have had to take on what's called adaptation strategies. For example, many women were forced into the job market to pop up their dwindling household incomes. People had to upskill and find higher paid skilled or even graduate jobs. People started to move to or commute to cities to find better paid jobs. People started to work longer hours. People often took on second or third jobs to make ends meet, such as home businesses or side hustles. Families increasingly had to rely on credit to keep pace with falling living standards. Credit cards, loans, overdraft, hire purchase, buy now, pay later schemes, etc. And also, interestingly, their house price was growing faster than their wages. So they started to see their houses rising value as the only way they could progress financially, and started to view it almost like as a cash machine with the potential to release equity at a later date. But despite all these so-called adaptation strategies, younger people are still worse off than the baby boomer generation were at a similar life stage. A UK Parliament Common Select Committee for Work and Pensions produced a report in 2015 stating that, and I quote, "There is abundant evidence to suggest that today's young workers are enduring a lower standard of living than today's pensioners did when they were the same age." End quote. Ponzi property. The elephant in the overpriced room. So let's start with housing. And that's because it's the main and most tangible injustice that young people face. As the chart shows, for the entire post-war period until around the millennium, house prices hovered around the multiple of around 4 to 4.5 times median salaries. This is significant because mortgage lenders typically only allow you to borrow around 4 to 4.5 times your salary. Therefore, for that entire half a century, an average house was affordable on an average median income. Therefore, home ownership more than doubled from 33% in 1947 to a record 71% in 2000. This era is known as the period of great prosperity, as it has been called, and it allowed the baby boomer generation to prosper. There would be a single breadwinner, and it would allow them to have a family and to allow women to become homemakers and stay at home and raise children. Then in 2001, house prices suddenly jumped to around 8 times average median earnings, and have remained there ever since. All of a sudden, for young people, they had a grim choice: either buy a property half the size. By the way, the UK already has some of the smallest housing in the world at around 85 square metres, or they would be forced to combine their incomes with a partner and both be on the mortgage. But I hear baby boomers cry, but interest rates were 12 or even 15% back in the early 1980s and are much lower now, so therefore it's no more expensive to buy a house than it used to be. Unfortunately, that's not true at all, and here's why. For a young person buying today, the lifetime cost of housing has actually tripled in a generation relative to median wages. But how can that be if interest rates are lower? Well, if you take into account all of the factors, including those lower interest rates, you have to look at the much larger deposits required now, the much larger amount paid in stamp duty, the change in mortgage interest rate tax relief, the much longer periods renting, don't forget that they rent for a much longer time before buying. The much longer mortgage periods, typically 30-year mortgages, are now quite common. The more frequent remortgaging fees, where you remortgage every few years to get a better interest rate. And also the big factor is much lower wage inflation. So if you factor in all of these issues, as shown in the report where we do a full time series calculation, you will discover that the cost of housing for young people has actually tripled relative to lifetime earnings. And that is why there's been a fundamental step change in how people buy housing. As a country, we have fundamentally shifted from being able to buy an average house on a single average income to now where it requires 2 good salaries, most likely graduate professional level salaries, where they're combined, and that has deep and profound ramifications for society and family life. For example, how do you have children? What if one of you gets sick? What if you need to care for an elderly family relative? So why has this been this jump in house prices? It's a complex mixture of factors including rising home ownership, lower interest rates, quantitative easing, mass immigration, a boom in buy-to-let landlords, a declining social housing, private housing developers deliberately restricting house building, the rise of the super rich and dirty money flooding the UK, demographic changes, contraception and double income, no kids yet, or dinkies as they're also known, and inheritance of housing from previous generations becoming more common. And even the more recent help to buy and shared ownership schemes have all driven up prices. But fundamentally, it's largely because housing is not a free market, but is actually the UK's largest Ponzi scheme and manipulated by government for political purposes. In fact, within the report, we call it Ponzi property. In essence, the early investors, the old, extract much more wealth than they put in, and the later investors, i.e. the young, prop up that shortfall in the Ponzi pyramid scheme by paying in much more than they should. And housing has become an investment vehicle where a significant part of personal and national wealth is locked up in bricks and mortar. And this is what's really significant. Consequently, we have an unspoken government policy to deliberately create a housing shortage to maintain artificially high house prices, to pander to the 64% that are homeowners, and to appease them and buy their vote, many of whom are older baby boomers who are unusually large cohort and also who tend to vote more because they have more of a stake in society. Imagine if the government had a magic wand to solve the housing crisis overnight by building millions of homes. It would never actually do so, because it would lower prices and alienate its core voter base. So democracy is actually the reason we have a housing crisis. Fundamentally, the home-owning majority have a vested interest in maintaining the housing crisis to maintain their property value and protect their investment. And it's the young first-time buyers that are the sacrificial lambs in that game. There are less of them, and the young tend to vote less. So where is the intergenerational theft in this? Well, put simply, the property that a baby boomer bought in the 1980s has rocketed so much in value due to that market manipulation we mentioned, and has increased well above inflation or even average wages, so that they have now become unjustifiably asset rich. The flip side of that coin is that young people are forced to pay massively more than the baby boomer generations did for that same average housing, so they are made much poorer. Property is a perfect example of a zero-sum game. There is no wealth creation per se, so therefore one person's profit, the baby boomer, can only come from making someone else poorer, i.e. the young. Who would have thought that the UK's greatest wealth creation scheme is actually the ultimate Ponzi scheme? But I hear the older generation cry, but you will inherit all of this one day, in what is misleadingly called the Great Wealth Transfer. But this is not true, and we can demonstrate this. The average property in the UK was worth £244,000 in 2021, and yet the mean average inheritance was just £47,000. And the median average inheritance was just £11,000. So where has the rest of the money gone, you may ask? Well, many baby boomers have released equity from their property to boost their pension, go on holidays, pay for social care, pay off other debts, and then there's inheritance tax, of course. So in short, not all of that house price inflation is going to be passed on to younger generations. So if you include all of these factors and do the calculations, how much is the intergenerational theft in housing? We calculate it as £3.56 trillion. Generation rent. Now, of course, buying a home is increasingly out of reach for most young people, except for those lucky enough to have the help of the bank of mum and dad. So increasingly getting on the housing ladder is not determined by hard work or graft, by a chance of birth and the family you were born into. So many young people are forced to continue renting, which has risen in price in line with house prices, or have had to move back or stay living at home with parents. And as of 2019, there were 3.3 million young people between the age of 20 and 34 still living at home with parents. So many young people are trapped in generation rent, a situation where they have no choice but to pay exorbitant amounts of rent to live in a shared house and pay someone else's mortgage. And because they are paying out such a large share of their salary, any chance of saving for the much bigger deposit required to actually buy a property somewhere is virtually impossible. It's like a return to the medieval feudal system of landlords and tenants, where you're trapped in a form of modern slavery or serfdom with no escape. To illustrate the extent of the problem, in 1997, an average first-time buyer was just 26 years old. But because of the doubling of house prices after the millennium and corresponding rental prices, in 2021, an average first-time buyer was 34 years old. That means an average young person has to spend around 13 years of their adult life paying rent. The consequence of this is that the percentage of private renters has doubled from around 10% in 2000 to 20% in 2020. And the real sting in the tail? Most of the properties that they're renting from will be owned by baby boomers who have become buy-to-let landlords to finance their shortfall in pension. So fundamentally, your rent is paying for their pension. So how much is the intergenerational theft for generation rent? We calculate it to be £570 billion. Ponzi pensions. First of all, you need to understand that our state pension and public sector pensions are both what are called pay-as-you-go or unfunded schemes. Many older people wrongly believe that there is some mythical pot of money in Her Majesty's Treasury that they've paid into all their life, and when they draw down their pensions, they are merely reclaiming what is rightfully theirs. The stark reality of a pay-as-you-go pension is that the money has already been spent on previous generations for general public spending. The money's gone. That's why it's called an unfunded pension. In essence, this means that when a young person currently pays into the system through their taxes and national insurance contributions, their money does not go into a pot to be invested for great returns in the future. No, these contributions by the current workforce go to pay the pensions of current pensioners. You might say that this is a reciprocal type of system that each generation benefits from, but that's not correct. The problem is the baby boomer generation didn't pay in very much at all, because back in the 70s, life expectancy was not expected to be as long. But since then, life expectancy has been risen dramatically, and so the baby boomer generation are drawing pensions in large numbers for much longer than was expected. And as the population ages, the so-called dependency ratio of pensioners to workers is also falling, putting an increasing burden on the working age population paying the taxes. And as the baby boomer generation begins to retire in the 2020s, this is the so-called pension time bomb that is sometimes referred to as putting an intolerable strain upon public finances. Fundamentally, it's the ultimate Ponzi scheme, with initial investors, i.e. the baby boomers, taking out far more than they put in, with the later investors, the young, having to pay in far more to keep the Ponzi scheme from collapsing. And to make matters even worse, the state pension is expected to be diminished or even phased out over time. And younger people are expected now to also pay in to a workplace pension on top of their normal taxes and national insurance contributions. And that workplace pension is considered to be more of an insurance type individual pension linked to your individual contributions. So fundamentally, baby boomers massively underpaid for their pension. In short, they will withdraw around 3 times the amount that they paid in. And yet younger people are expected to pay for their own pension, plus also pay for the shortfall in the baby boomer pensions. So how much is the intergenerational theft in pensions? We estimate the shortfall to be around £1.37 trillion for the state pension and 1.86 trillion for public sector pensions. So that's a total intergenerational theft of £3.23 trillion. National debt. The UK's current national debt is £2.2 trillion. That's over 100% of our gross domestic product, our GDP. National debt is best described as the cumulative overspending by the government, which has built up over a number of years and decades. Think of it like the country's current credit card balance. Although it's not to be confused with the public deficit, which is usually meaning to be the annual shortfall of government income taxes to meet government spending in that particular year. There is a natural tendency for governments to iron out the economic shocks of the economic cycle, crises and unpredictable events. We saw that graphically with the financial crash of 2008 and 9, the pandemic of 2020 and 21, and the more recent high inflation leading to the cost of living crisis in 2022. But in all cases, despite the government believing in free markets, they were expected to step in and inject public money to prevent irreparable damage to the economy. This so-called Keynesian approach to economic recovery is generally regarded as the right thing to do, though. However, the theory is that the borrowing should be repaid in the good times to make sure the public finances balance over that economic cycle are recovered to be in good shape for the next crisis, which inevitably happens. The problem is that we already had a very high national debt before the succession of crises. And there was also what is called a structural deficit, where tax revenues are consistently lower than spending across the entire economic cycle. There were a number of political reasons for this, of course: the constant demand for better public services and the counter-demand for reduced taxation. But ultimately it means that the taxpayer has consistently never paid enough to fund public spending, and the remaining spending has had to be funded through borrowing, which continually adds to that national debt. In short, this means that the baby boomer generation had a lower taxation than they should have had paid in, and better public services than they actually paid for. There is the counter-argument that national debt is a good thing, and investment in infrastructure benefits future generations. But this is a bogus argument on many levels. Firstly, there is the principle that you cannot have taxation without representation. Young people were not able to vote and did not agree to this. Furthermore, the vast majority of national debt has not been to invest in infrastructure for future generations, but was actually spent in crises to bail out banks, the COVID crisis, and fund general under-taxation and overspending by previous generations of taxpayers. And guess who pays for the national debt? Yep, you've guessed it, the young. Not only do they have to pay the annual £42 billion in interest payments just to maintain the debt, they also need to figure out how to actually pay down the actual debt, which is now more than 100% of GDP. Now, of course, the older generation are not entirely responsible for all the national debt. They inherited some smaller amounts of national debt from previous generations to them. The younger generation are also currently undertaxed and receiving public services that they have not fully paid for. Nonetheless, the age difference means that the majority of the national debt is the responsibility of the older generation. So we have assumed it to be around 75% of that. So if you factor in all of the costs of paying off the national debt, plus also the inevitable interest payments over the next 30 years, how much is the intergenerational theft? We calculate it to be £3.3 trillion. Privatisations. Over the period 1977 to 2013, the UK government sold off a large number of state assets. You will probably remember the main ones, such as British Airways, British Petroleum, British Steel, and of course the entire rail network and all of the utility companies, including British Gas, British Telecom, National Power, and the water companies as well. Now, we're not going to get into the relative merits of public versus privately run companies here, but what we can be certain about is that this raft of privatisations created a one-off windfall for the government and taxpayer at that time. In other words, that generation gained hugely economically. All of this was done for political and electoral reasons, of course. The windfalls profoundly helped finance the Conservative government's agenda from 1979 to 1997, for example, to artificially lower the highest rate of income tax, especially for the wealthy, to allow more public spending and public services than would otherwise have been possible, and also to artificially boost short-term economic growth. And this was fundamentally a political bribe for the voters, and it was primarily the baby boomer generation who benefited from this one-off windfall throughout the 1980s and 1990s. Fundamentally, this was like selling off the family silver at a knockdown price and never replacing it. These state-owned assets had been built up over many decades by the taxpayer to serve the taxpayer, and the proceeds of these privatisations were never reinvested in other state assets or projects for future generations. But what was really astonishing about that series of privatisations was how little the government got for flogging off all of these state assets. If you adjust the receipts of those privatisations into current prices, it's very little. Our analysis of the intergenerational theft of privatisations is just £83.5 billion. PFI schemes. Now, the electorate invariably always wants more public spending, but almost always seems reluctant to actually pay more taxes for it. But here's a clever way to pay for it. Let's find a way to get future unborn generations to pay for it. Behold the Private Finance Initiative, or PFI as it's also known, which was used to finance around 700 or more public sector projects such as new schools, hospitals and other government buildings. The taxpayer then pays this off in instalments over 25 to 30 years to cover the debt repayment, financing costs, maintenance and other services provided. It's comparable to leasing a car rather than purchasing a car, seemingly attractive in the short term but potentially much more costly in the long run. The public get their shiny new buildings quickly, taxes don't have to be increased, at least not at the time, something which governments and taxpayers both want, and the private company makes a modest profit. It's a win-win, everybody's happy. So what's the catch? Well, many of the contracts run up to 2040, and many local bodies will be shackled to these expensive contracts for decades to come. And the overall cost of the contracts were much more than if the government had just borrowed the money at the time. The cost of capital to finance PFI projects is between 2% and 4% above the cost of government borrowing, and that high margin is in essence due to the higher returns of the private investors who expect to make a profit. In fact, in 2018, the National Audit Office condemned the record of PFI contracts. And also that year, Sir Howard Davies, Chairman of the Royal Bank of Scotland, RBS, was quoted as saying that PFI had been, and I quote, a fraud on the people. Unsurprisingly, in 2018, the scheme was dropped by the government and no new projects were approved. Whilst it could be argued that the young will eventually use some or all of these infrastructure projects at some point in their life, the really pernicious thing about PFI schemes is that the young will be the people that will be paying it off up to 2040 and beyond, i.e. those not yet entitled to vote or those not even born yet. They had absolutely no say in the scheme. Is that not an outrageous abuse of so-called democracy? So how much is the intergenerational theft of PFI schemes? We believe it's around £82.4 billion. Student fees. Now, the original justification and case for introducing student fees was that the graduate should contribute to their education on the assumption that a graduate degree provides a higher salary and a higher standard of living, and therefore the graduate should reasonably be expected to contribute to that, rather than all taxpayers effectively subsidising the education of a tiny elite. But this argument is now completely flawed on several levels. Firstly, there has been a massive expansion of higher education. The participation rate had stabilised at around 12 to 14% in the 1970s and 80s, and then there was a sharp expansion in the 1990s where the rate shot up to over 43% and had increased to 50% in 2017 to 18. It's therefore no longer true that to become a graduate is to be a part of a lucky elite. A graduate degree is usually a basic requirement for most skilled jobs in the economy with any sort of decent salary. But the effect of this expansion has been the devaluation of having a degree. The jobs market is now oversaturated with so many graduates that there simply aren't enough graduate jobs in the economy for that 50% who are now graduates. Yes, graduates over their lifetime generally earn more than non-graduates, but the argument of this entire report proves that students graduating now will actually have a much lower standard of living than the previous generations who only had semi-skilled or blue-collar jobs. So the claim that graduates earn a higher salary and should therefore contribute to their education is simply no longer true. Graduates are now being forced to pay student fees for an education that results in effectively lower salaries and a lower standard of living than previous generations. So where does the intergenerational aspect come into this? Well, the introduction of student fees completely breaks the intergenerational social contract, i.e. of those in work paying for the education of the young and the care of the old. It's a reciprocal system that civilized society is based upon. The taxpayers at the time ultimately saved money by not paying for the higher education of younger people and externalized that cost onto those younger people in the form of student loans, which was repayable through their salary, resulting in a considerable debt for those future generations. So how much is that intergenerational theft? We calculate it as £458 billion. North Sea oil and gas. Now, most countries around the world regard oil and gas as natural resources so profoundly important that it's considered a national asset. In fact, if you look, around 75% of the world's production and 90% of proven oil reserves are actually in the hands of state-owned oil and gas companies. Now, what's interesting in the UK is that the North Sea exploration can actually be compared very closely to that of Norway for a number of reasons. Norway essentially owns the other half of the North Sea continental shelf and oil and gas reserves in that area, and since the 1960s has extracted a very similar amount of oil and gas. However, the UK and Norway took ideologically diametrically opposed approaches with three key differences in terms of ownership, taxation, and fundamentally what to do with the windfall from North Sea oil and gas. Since 1986, the UK government has fully privatised the upstream sector, meaning that the only method of revenue generation was via taxation. The tax take is now very small, and in fact, for the past decade or so, unbelievably, the taxpayer has actually been subsidising oil and gas exploration in the North Sea. So the UK taxpayer has actually been propping up the profits of private oil and gas companies. In contrast, Norway since 1990 has saved and invested a percentage of the oil and gas revenues into a sovereign wealth fund, more formally known as the Government Pension Fund Global. Notably, Norway now has a $1.3 trillion sovereign wealth fund, worth about $250,000 for each Norwegian citizen, and it's the largest sovereign wealth fund in the world. Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Kuwait, and Qatar have all placed their oil and gas revenues in similar sovereign wealth funds. However, because the UK privatised its oil and gas industry, what has the UK got to show for its North Sea windfall? In short, very little. The Conservative UK government of the 1980s squandered the North Sea oil proceeds on short-term tax cuts, mass unemployment, and government spending, which benefited the baby boomer generation. And quite astonishingly, the UK's former Secretary of State for the Environment at the time, Michael Heseltine, has also admitted that Britain under Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher, and I quote, squandered the windfall, end quote, on short-term consumerist policies such as subsidised housing and mortgage tax relief policies. Michael Heseltine also said that he would have preferred to see the money invested in a sovereign wealth fund. But most significantly about those tax cuts were that they uniquely benefited the baby boomer generation by temporarily lowering taxes for that generation, whilst at the same time denying future generations of the benefits of the exploitation of that national asset. In short, it made the baby boomers artificially richer and future generations poorer. Look at it this way. It speaks volume about our deeply entrenched and dogmatic free market ideology in the UK, that whilst the oil and gas companies are making massive profits from the oil price rises during this inflationary period in 2022, the masses suffer a cost of living crisis due to those rocketing energy, food and transport prices. It was only under intense public pressure did the Conservative government in May 2022 announce a profit levy, i.e. a windfall tax in all but name. So how much is the intergenerational theft of North Sea oil and the squandered revenues? If we assume the figure we could have had if we had put it into a sovereign wealth fund, which is the £930 billion we calculated earlier, minus the revenues we actually gained in taxation in the 80s and 90s, which was around £400 billion, the intergenerational theft therefore is around £515 billion. Climate change. And lastly, we shall finish with what is arguably the biggest act of intergenerational theft: climate change. It's a problem we all have to face up to, or is it? No, climate change is overwhelmingly an intergenerational issue because climate change is predominantly the result of older generations creating an unsustainable carbon economy that burnt the world's finite fossil fuel resources, and it's the older generation who primarily benefited from that artificially cheap energy because they didn't pay the full environmental cost. Future generations will have to. If you're over 60, you realistically don't need to worry about climate change, as you will not be around to pay the financial price of climate change or have to deal with the consequences. In economic speak, older people have externalized the true cost of artificially cheap energy by passing on the cost to future generations. It is primarily the young who will have to pay the economic price for halting and or reversing climate change. One of the main reasons for failure to tackle climate change, of course, is the complete failure to limit consumption and control population growth, which has virtually doubled from 4 billion people in 1975 to 7.9 billion in 2022. So any attempt to reduce an individual's consumption by a few percent are utterly meaningless in this context. And of course, there are huge vested interests in a growing population, a growing pool of cheap labour, expanding consumer base, etc. And our entire economic model is predicated upon continual economic growth, something that Greta Thunberg rightly mocked in her speech, where she quoted fairy tales of eternal economic growth. So just like with the housing crisis, there is absolutely no political will to solve overpopulation. Businesses, politicians and many voters actively want high population growth because it results in rising living standards for them. So how much will it cost future generations to stop climate change and halt global warming to 1.5 degrees centigrade? There's general consensus figure that it's around $50 trillion that needs to be spent globally over the next 30 years. But the world will still get 1.5 degrees centigrade warmer, even with that much investment. And that has economic consequences. Rising energy costs, extreme weather damage, food price rises, ice sheets melting and sea levels rising, loss of usable land, destruction of biodiversity and collapsing ecosystems. And these costs have been estimated at an additional $18 trillion over a 30-year period. But what's interesting from the point of view of this report is when exactly the world started warming. It started around 1945, post-World War II, exactly as the baby boomer generation were growing up, in an era of cheap fuel and reaping the benefits of massive rises in living standards. In short, we can confidently attribute the majority of climate change to the consumption pattern of the baby boomer generation, especially from the 1980s onwards. So, in total, the global impact of climate change will cost around $68 trillion globally. So let's assume that the UK accounts for around 3% of the global economy, and we will therefore have to pay a proportionate amount to mitigate climate change. This means that the UK will have to pay around $2.1 trillion to mitigate climate change. Now, of course, young people also consume food, goods, energy, also go on international flights, etc. But the reality is that their short time on the planet means that they have had a much smaller impact on the climate than an older person who has been a consumer for over 60 years or so. Therefore, we estimate that around 75% of climate change has been caused by consumption patterns of the older generation. Therefore, the intergenerational theft is in the order of 1.6 trillion times 0.75, around 1.2 trillion pounds. Conclusion. So if you add up all of the intergenerational theft across these 8 key areas of government, what do you get? We calculate a total figure of £13 trillion, which, if you spread across the approximate 30 million young people that are currently alive in the UK, equates to around £433,000 per person over their lifetime. Just imagine if young people could recoup some of that money. What a difference that would make to their lives. What an impact that would make to society, and would increase the equality between generations. So what are the consequences of intergenerational theft? Well, we've mentioned a lot of them already. Fundamentally, it puts increasing strain on younger people. They've been forced into higher skill, higher paid jobs. They're having to work harder, longer. Both people in a couple are having to work. They're having to delay all of their milestones, such as moving out of home, to getting married, to getting on the housing ladder, to having children. And some of them, those milestones are being pushed ever further away, to the point where people are not getting on the housing ladder until 35, 40, not having children until their late 30s. And of course, there's a closing window of opportunity there for children and mortgages. Beyond 40, it becomes increasingly difficult to have either. And of course, it puts increasing strain on people. We're seeing a huge impact upon young people in terms of stress, anxiety, depression, because of the increasing pressure to get good exam grades so that they can get to university, to get the best paid jobs. Where does this cycle lead to ultimately? It leads to a very unhappy, unfulfilled, frustrated generation that feel like they're having to work harder and harder to achieve less and less. What about family life? What about relationships? What about children's development? It seems to me that the economic obsession with money, housing, personal advancement is to the detriment of relationships, of family life, of children's development, of society in general. I think we're going to see an increasingly fractured society, not only between the rich and the poor, but between generations, but also within family units. They're not going to be as close and as bonded as one. Ultimately, that is a very bleak outlook for a future society. So I'll leave you with this one thought. When older people rub their hands with glee at the price of their property increasing, do you think they care about these factors impacting future generations? The evidence suggests they don't. Solutions. Fundamentally, whilst baby boomers dominate the electorate, the media, the political scene, and they vote more, governments will always pander to their economic interests. Furthermore, whilst home ownership remains the majority at 64%, governments will do everything they can to maintain those high house prices. So until home ownership rates actually fall to below 50%, nothing's fundamentally going to change in terms of house prices. Only once renters become a significant part of the electorate, or even a majority over 50%, will something be done to bring down rents and high house prices. But fundamentally, in terms of solutions, there are things we can do. For example, we need to engage young people more in politics to vote more. We need to perhaps look at lowering the voting age from 18 to 16. We need to educate the electorate about these intergenerational issues. That's part of the reason for this report and this website. And make the media more aware of the economic realities, rather than this complete false narrative of rising living standards and the young never had it so good, which is all complete nonsense if you look at the economics. So what are the other solutions? Well, I mean, you could produce your own website, your own pressure group. You could do a study on a different country, not just the UK. You could look at, campaigning. You could lobby your MP. You could spread the word on social media with this book, or your own analysis, your own thoughts on the issue. There's plenty of other books. You can support another organisations that have a similar message. They're all great as well. So I think there's a number of things younger people could do, but I think spreading awareness is probably the key one for me, because if you have a lot of young people that believe the false narrative, they're going to buy into that and think they've failed, but actually it's the system that's failed them. So what other actions could you take? Well, ultimately, as with any burning injustice, the people responsible and beneficiaries of that injustice, i.e. the baby boomers, fundamentally rely upon you and I doing nothing about it. That's a profound truth here. Things will only change if people protest about it and kick up a fuss. So you should be very angry. Obviously within the law, you should protest peacefully, etc., etc. But fundamentally, you should be angry. You should protest. You should kick up a fuss. You should challenge your parents. You should get angry at them for having an artificially high standard of living by blighting your life, your future prospects. Give them this report. Give them this website to read. They may actually learn something that really fundamentally gets through to them. They may completely reject it, in which case you know what their agenda is. They're part of the same denial of this truth. So it's about kicking up a fuss. It's about spreading awareness. It's about getting through to people. It's about educating them and breaking through this mass media propaganda that the young have never had it so good. It's not true. It's intergenerational theft. That's what's actually happening. So don't let them get away with it. Fight for your future. And saving the best to last. Have a really expensive party. Don't worry about the consequences. And in the morning, present the huge bill and put it on your parents' credit card without asking them. And say, well, this is exactly the same as what you've done to my generation and to my future, to the tune of £13 trillion and £433,000 per person. Now you know how it feels. And then wait for the reaction on their face when you present them with this report. Take a photo and post it on social media with the hashtags OKBoomer and hashtag intergenerational theft. I've spent 10 years of my life on and off researching and writing this report, creating this website, creating this pressure group to raise awareness, to elicit change. And I've done all of this at great personal and private cost, financially, emotionally, physically. I feel I've done much more than most. What are you going to do to solve intergenerational theft? The Intergenerational Theft Report is the first step in that process of helping young people to reclaim the media and political agenda, reclaim what's been stolen from them, and to reclaim their futures. Don't forget to press like below and to subscribe to the YouTube channel Intergenerational Theft. And don't forget also that the full report is available to download for free from the website www.intergenerationaltheft.org. Thank you very much.